Helsinki, and if I understand correctly, the title of his paper is Global Cities and Ecological Contradictions in Historical Capitalism.
Yeah.
Take it away.
I guess really what I'm going to do here is I'm just trying to get you to read this article, which I wrote. So this really is the beginning of an agenda. It's the beginning of a research project. So I'm sort of trying to make a particular kind of argument to start thinking in a certain direction. So really what I'm going to give you is a sort of a glorified abstract of this article, and then if you're interested, you can read it. I guess, as Jason mentioned a moment ago, I'm not an ecologist, and I'm not really a geographer. I guess my centre of gravity is sort of political theory and political economy. So I've arrived at this agenda by working out from more particular problems. And I think a lot of ecologists, they start with the bigger picture, and then they work down to particular empirical things they want to talk about, or particular problems. And I started with a problem, and I've ended up at ecology. There's no PowerPoint presentation, so it's just me. I guess I came to want to talk about global cities by looking at a very particular global city, which is the global city in the country of my birth, which is London and Britain. And what has happened in Britain over the last 30 or 40 years, Britain is probably the most intensely neoliberalized, arguably neoliberalized core state, where neoliberalism has been a project, been applied to that country. And what's happened in the last 30 years is there's been a reconfiguration of the state territory with the retreat from empire and deindustrialization. Britain has been left really as a rump state, which surrounds this massive global city. And that has had profound effects for the state territory and for politics and for strategies of political resistance to power. And I suppose the political problems which I'm thinking through are problems that have left a lot of people baffled in the last, say, 10 years. So the rise of Scottish nationalism, the Scottish National Party, the emergence of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, as a credible electoral force, the prolonged austerity politics, which have been feebly resisted, and hung parliaments, and, of course, the recent baffling withdrawal from the EU. So I started with these problems, and I've tried to think how the existing sociological categories of how people have looked at class and the constituent nations and the state territory as a whole lack a certain geographical understanding of how Britain has been reconfigured, and therefore requires new categories and new concepts to understand. So I started with that, and then I moved on to the most signal feature, which is the rise of metropolitan oligarchy. And it's a metropolitan oligarchy, which of course is a global metropolitan oligarchy, instantiated in various places. But of course, it led me to look at global cities, and then looking more generically at global cities, and then thinking, well, why have global cities emerged in the particular way they have? Why have they emerged what looks almost like a strategic response that's always, of course, contingent, because all global cities are different, but nevertheless seems to betray some sort of common set of social forces, which of course then led me to thinking situating the global city in the world system, and then attempting to ground that, if you like, I don't like the metaphor, but ground it in the material medium of a capitalist world system, and then that led me to thinking more about ecology. I guess the particular problem I've got, and the focus of the argument, is that despite the emergence of global oligarchy, global metropolitan oligarchy, in Britain especially, but global cities generally, are always legitimised and always talked about in the liberal discourse of the city, which talks about effectively that you can sort of see there's a discourse that goes all the way back to Bernard Manville, through Adam Smith, through even people like Georg Simmel, through even to sort of a lot of the assemblage thinking and network society about global cities. And it's the idea of the city of speed, the city of deterritorialization, of liberating itself from the encoding and inframing structures that surround it. And therefore the city as a sort of a grumbling hive of productivity and wealth creation. The problem that I've got is that, drawing on my own experiences growing up in that state, was that the global city to me increasingly was a place that could be described, I guess, with a different vocabulary. A vocabulary that would include words like concentration, enclosure, privatization, intensified arborescence, stratification, social cleansing, oligarchy, enforced scarcity, urban spectacle, rent seeking, and conspicuous consumption. So, I guess my argument is an attempt to try and think about the global city that incorporates these ideas and the themes that are emergent in the global city, such as, well, chronic contradictions between use and exchange values in housing, mounting labour surpluses locally, hugely uneven enjoyment of productivity gains, ecological damage from resource consumption, so on and so forth. And what I wanted to do is sort of think, Sharp and Wallach wrote a book in the late 80s called Visions of the Modern City. And they talked about how by the end of the 20th century, the city form had become effectively a dispersed urban field. That the city was no longer legible. It no longer had some kind of set of historic themes. It had no longer a discernible structure. It's a 100-mile city, this sort of stuff. So I want to start thinking how, in its interactions with the hinterlands to these global cities and with their situatedness in a world system, how the global city is becoming legible. It has a certain purpose, potentially. It has a certain form. There is an isomorph running through these geosocial formations. And if you think about what these words mean, words start to come to your mind, like rent-seeking, appropriation. These things have an instant resonance with a certain type of political economy. This is where we get to the ecology part, I suppose. So I'll just perhaps read out a few sections that, if you string them together, give you an idea of how this is ecologically viable, ecologically relevant, and then how it comes back to the problem of resisting power in states that are dominated by global cities. So, if we think about global finance capital, if we assume that it's entering into a phase where the 3% annual compound growth that capitalism requires to be reproduced and to survive, if we imagine that that's coming to an end, then we can see in the core states that there is a macroeconomic situation where capital value and surplus is realized no longer through expanded production, but one witnesses an inversion of the historic frontier of capital. If this is the way we characterize the world system, then we're confronted rather by a kind of zero-sum political economy where the purposive annihilation of capitals and the constant internalization of limits become axiomatic, where predation and accumulation by dispossession become the principal tactics in the perpetual low-growth environment incapable of solving the ongoing crises of capital accumulation at the level of the totality. So this, of course, is assuming that capitalism as an ecological totality that perpetually expands and contracts via spatio-temporal displacement, of course, historically more expands than contracts, then capitalist production can plausibly continue indefinitely. That's a problem. I get that. We can come back to that at the end. But it means that the role of the global city in the reconfiguration of this capitalist world system then becomes potentially an enabling socio-geographic structural device for realizing, through the unique intensities of its form, those necessary spatio-temporal fixes on the grandest scale of historical capitalism that facilitate continuous strategic global displacement through the mechanisms of switching crises. This is, of course, what I've witnessed in Britain. The capital of Sheffield and Manchester is now cities in China and golf courses in the Gulf states. This will entail innumerable but systematic and identifiable asymmetries in the reproduction of capital, most likely in the form of devastating local retreats of capital at various thresholds of transcendence. If you think about the destruction of the labour movement in Britain and the destruction of social democracy, if you want to call it that, which can manifest in all sorts of ways: destruction of built environments, provincial deindustrialisation, relocation of production regimes, liquidation of organised labour, neglecting local provincial infrastructures. These all take place under command and control of the global city. So there's an increasingly limited scope, therefore, if we assume there's an increasingly limited scope for the conventional disciplining and reboot device of capital accumulation through other strategies like war in the global regime of accumulation, unless it's war waged within a polity upon its own citizens. Hence the increasing blurring between military and police actions. So, it therefore seems that the requisite, the necessary grand reconfiguration in the spatio-temporal regime of accumulation, shifting cores, spatio-temporal fixes, and the reproduction, and its reproduction, will require a new geographic logic and a new apparatus through which an effective social architecture of fixity and flow can be actualized across the world, and an appropriate physiological tempo of urban geography established. So I argue that the global city, with its awesome dispositional and pastoral power, through the unique intensities of its form, I'm going to have to expand on that, over extensive populations, constitutes a strategic device which is executant of this logic. If the institutional armatures of disciplinary power, which were germane to the industrial age, if they're already in crisis, then a new governmental apparatus of control with pan-global scope will likely emerge. If the barracks and the school and the factory are no good at disciplining, something more in the idiom of governmental apparatuses will have to emerge. Perhaps the global city is some sort of urban form satisfying that need. So, as I've said, the fundamental aim here is to counter the celebratory imaginary that today suffuses the common presentation of the 21st century global city in liberal apologetics. It's the fable of the bees, inspired by liberal ideology, and it sees the great city as a grumbling hive of industriousness, creativity, peace, freedom, felicity, sensuous self-realization, etc. It is the historically contingent, so if we think about the global city then, it's the historically contingent form in which social forces of historical necessity are met that is decisive. If we assume that, then we have to ask, in what direction will the so-called century of the city take us, when we're going to reach a point in the 20th century where, I don't know, most people live in large cities? Okay. Should be okay. Okay. I was going to talk about Foucault, how he talked about the city, for cities, with the problems that they raised, the particular forms that they took, served as the models for the governmental rationality that was to apply to a whole territory. It's just an idea of the particular importance of cities. Okay. Okay. Thinking about world ecology and what we're going to do about it, the imperative collectively to apply human reason to the resolution of dangerous ecological contradictions in the global mode of production runs up against the crucial problem. And it's the problem of collective human agency. If we cannot frame comprehensive schemes of ends amongst peoples based upon collective evaluation of civilizational circumstances, that was Lewis Mumford, i.e. a conscious control over the world ecology, then some form of mechanisms will have to emerge to do that in place of rational government. And sorry, emergency alert flash for the wall. Okay. That such a mechanism shall come into being for the securing of the continuation of life in terms of the biopolitical population ought not to be dismissed simply as a Malthusian determinism. In the historical materialist understanding of history, properly relating the contingent to the necessary is a crucial strategic task. So, I guess if I guess what I'm trying to say is that if I'll just skip all this. I guess what I'm trying to say is that that we should start thinking about the global city as not only a structural device for disciplining populations, but thinking about it in terms of the historic social forces in the world system that it's situated in. The contradictions, the ecological contradictions of the world system, the inversion of the frontier of the capitalist world system, and the switch over from the expanded reproduction that we've experienced at the two to the accumulation by dispossession and appropriation that seems to characterize so much of capitalist surplus accumulation and extraction, then we can start to see how the global city has emerged between the necessity of those social forces and the contingency of political action, i.e. political elites who in a zero-sum capitalist totality need to keep the reproduction of capitalism going by shifting capital around, but need to also maintain their control over the surplus. And we have to look for what the devices of appropriation and the kind of mechanisms, structures and apparatuses that are very apposite for them to do that are. And I think the global city is one of those. To come back to the beginning, what this means, this all sounds very pessimistic. It sounds like a 21st century of an increasingly authoritarian government through the global city and the sod all we can do about it. Not really, because what this is about is identifying what's necessary and what conditions possibilities. But then it's down to us to determine what kind of strategic counterconducts, what kind of politically contingent action we're going to engage in within those conditions. So really, it's a way to understand that in the British case, for example, we need to start recognizing that it is the global city inside our very state and the concentrated positionalities of surplus capture that we need to concentrate our radical action towards. And in Britain, that's simply not the case, because nobody does that. I haven't had a chance to talk about geotechnic assemblage. I haven't had a chance to talk about some examples, for example, through housing, transport, work, policing, how these things are realized. Haven't had a chance to talk about what I mean by authoritarian governmentality, but that's not important. You can always read that. And I have a list here of all the reasons why it's useful to think about the global city in this way, but if we have time, we'll go to the Q&A on that. Okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is a bit of something that it's derived from my research in this particular region. I'm doing for my doctoral research, I'm doing a more ethnographically focused one. This work partially draws from some of the ethnographic material that I've been working on, but also from the review of the social and environmental history of the region, and I will try to propose here a couple of ideas of interpretation of this history over the long term. So, traveling southward from Santiago, just after crossing the Biobío River, which up to the second half of the 19th century marked the beginning of the stubbornly autonomous Mapuche homeland, one enters into a quite astonishing landscape. Valleys upon valleys are covered by eucalyptus and pine trees, all lined up with mathematical precision. This landscape represents the metabolic underpinnings of Chile's experimental and increasingly aging brand of neoliberalism, an ecology which has, of course, developed its own ideological forms. Although nowadays hardly hegemonic, the nonetheless dominant narrative tells a tale of a successful forced transition Chile being one of the few Latin American countries to halt its deforestation rate and achieve one of the highest afforestation, that is covering degraded lands with trees, rates. Effectively, a reversal of the environmental debacle inherited from the late 19th century and early 20th century, when this region was incorporated into the Chilean state and millions of hectares of forest were burned. The historical picture emerging here is that of two moments, basically pulling in opposite directions. In one, the forest cover advances, and then in the other, it retreats. Then this very society reaches a point of maturity in which the tree cover once again expands. So the so-called forest transitions in certain parts of the literature. Of course, there are many obvious criticisms to be made here, starting with the conflation of native forests with plantations, of course, and all these criticisms applicable to the modernization theory implicit in the whole account. But I want to develop this paper's argument from a critique to the dualism implicit in the ideological forms emergent from this socio-natural order. How its understanding of ecological transformations by locating the dynamic